The student who failed every single test for 3 years taught me the most important lesson about Buddha's wisdom. This is that story. My name is Professor David Chen, and I was Harvard's most demanding Buddhist studies professor. In 30 years of teaching, I had never accepted anything less than perfection. My classes had the highest dropout rate in the university. Students called me the Dream Crusher. I believed that Buddha's path required absolute intellectual mastery, flawless understanding of scripture, and perfect performance in every test. I thought that if you couldn't recite the Dhammapada perfectly, analyze Buddhist philosophy with precision, or score at least 95% on every exam, you had no business calling yourself a Buddhist student. My reputation was built on producing academic excellence. Students feared my classes, but they respected the rigorous standards. I had published extensively, won teaching awards, and my former students went on to become respected scholars worldwide. Then came Marcus Williams. Marcus was a 20-year-old student with severe learning disabilities who enrolled in my advanced Buddhism course. From day one, I could see he was going to be a problem. Marcus couldn't read Sanskrit, struggled with basic philosophical concepts, and took twice as long as other students to process simple information. But what truly frustrated me was his persistence. Marcus failed every single quiz, bombed every midterm, and turned in assignments that barely made sense. For 3 straight years, he never once passed a test in my class. Any rational student would have dropped out after the first semester. I tried everything to get Marcus to quit. I humiliated him publicly by pointing out his mistakes in front of the entire class. I set impossible standards that I knew he couldn't meet. I even suggested multiple times that he should consider switching to an easier major, something more suited to his abilities. But Marcus kept showing up. He would sit in the front row, taking notes frantically even though I knew he understood maybe 10% of what I was saying. He would ask questions that revealed his complete confusion about basic concepts. And worst of all, he would smile. This genuine, peaceful smile that drove me absolutely crazy. How could someone so academically hopeless remain so determined? How could he smile when he was failing so spectacularly? It became an obsession for me. If Marcus couldn't understand basic Buddhist concepts after 3 years of study, what did that say about my teaching? How could I consider myself a successful professor if I couldn't reach even one struggling student? The breaking point came during his 3rd year, after Marcus had failed yet another major exam, scoring just 23% on a test about compassion in Buddhist practice. I had reached my limit. In front of the entire advanced seminar class, filled with Harvard's brightest graduate students, I finally exploded. "Marcus," I shouted, my voice echoing through the lecture hall, "you clearly don't understand anything about Buddhism. You failed every single test for 3 years. How can you keep pretending to be a Buddhist student? How can you sit there smiling when you're demonstrating complete ignorance of everything we study?" The classroom fell into dead silence. 40 graduate students stared in shock. I had never lost my composure like that before. Marcus stood up slowly, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. But instead of running out in shame like I expected, he looked directly at me and said something that would shatter my entire worldview. "Professor Chen," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "I absolutely understand the words in the books. I can't memorize the sutras or analyze the philosophical arguments. I can't read Sanskrit or pass your tests. He paused, tears now flowing freely down his face. "But every morning when I sit in meditation, Buddha's love so strongly it makes me cry with joy. When I see homeless people on my way to class, Buddha's compassion moves through me, and I give them my lunch money, even when I'm hungry myself. When my classmates mock my failures, Buddha's forgiveness fills my heart, and I genuinely pray for their happiness." The entire room was transfixed. Marcus continued, "When I volunteer at the children's hospital every weekend, I see Buddha in every sick child's eyes. When my grandmother was dying last year, I held her hand and felt Buddha's peace flow through us both. When I struggle with my learning disability every day, Buddha's patience teaches me to be kind to myself." His voice grew stronger. "Professor, I may fail every test about Buddha, but Buddha lives in my heart every moment of every day. I don't just study compassion, I live it. I don't just read about loving kindness, I practice it. I don't just memorize teachings about inner peace, I experience it." He looked around the room at his classmates, then back at me. "Isn't that what Buddhism is really about? Not perfect test scores, but perfect love. Not flawless understanding of texts, but flawless compassion for people." In that moment, standing in front of my Harvard classroom with my mouth hanging open, I realized I had spent 30 years teaching about Buddha, while Marcus had been living with Buddha. Here was this failing student who understood Buddha's essence better than I did, better than any of my A+ graduate students did, better than I had after 3 decades of scholarly study. Marcus embodied everything Buddha taught, while I had only intellectualized it. He lived compassion, while I had only analyzed it. He practiced loving kindness, while I had only lectured about it. I had been measuring spiritual growth with academic metrics, completely missing the point of everything Buddha taught. That day changed everything. I publicly apologized to Marcus in front of the entire class and asked him to become my co-teacher. Together, we created what became known as the Marcus Method, a revolutionary approach to Buddhist education that valued heart wisdom over academic performance. We redesigned the entire curriculum. Instead of just studying texts, students now practiced meditation, volunteered in the community, and learned to recognize Buddha's presence in daily life. Instead of only testing intellectual understanding, we evaluated spiritual growth, compassion in action, and the development of inner peace. Marcus, who had never passed a single traditional test, became the most beloved teacher in our department. Students called him the Heart Professor. He taught them that Buddha's truth isn't found in perfect test scores, but in perfect compassion. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Students who had been struggling academically suddenly flourished when they learned to connect with Buddha through their hearts instead of just their minds. Our program went from having the highest dropout rate to having a waiting list of students wanting to enroll. Harvard's Buddhist Studies program became the most sought after in the world, not for its academic rigor, but for its transformational power. We weren't just producing scholars anymore, we were nurturing awakened human beings. The Marcus Method spread to over 200 universities worldwide, proving that Buddha's wisdom isn't about intellectual superiority. It's about love in action, compassion in practice, and peace in daily living. I wrote a book about our experience called The Failing Student's Enlightenment, which became a global bestseller and showed educators everywhere how the worst student had become my greatest teacher. Marcus graduated with the highest honors our program had ever given, not in academics, but in embodying Buddha's love. At graduation, he received a standing ovation that lasted 10 minutes. Today, the Marcus Method has transformed Buddhist education globally. We've proven that Buddha's wisdom isn't about intellectual superiority. It's about love in action, compassion in practice, and peace in daily living. Marcus taught me that Buddha doesn't care about your GPA. He doesn't measure your worth by test scores or academic achievements. Buddha sees your heart, your intentions, your capacity for love. The student who failed every test passed the most important test of all, being human. If you're struggling in school, if you feel like you're not smart enough, if you've been told you'll never amount to anything, remember Marcus. Remember that your worth isn't measured by grades, but by the love you bring to the world. Buddha's wisdom flows through open hearts, not perfect report cards. The greatest teachings aren't found in textbooks, but in how we treat each other with kindness every single day. If this message touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to know that they're valuable beyond any test score. Subscribe to learn how to connect with Buddha through your heart instead of your head. Comment "heart" if you believe that Buddha's love matters more than Buddha's knowledge. Marcus failed every test but passed the most important one of all, being a vessel for divine love in a world that desperately needs it. That's the lesson that changed everything for me, and I hope it changes everything for you too.